Hi, my name is Todd Carter. I'm a Principal Premier Field Engineer working for Microsoft. In this module, we will discuss Business Connectivity Services in SharePoint 2010. We will start with an overview of BCS and then move on to discuss how we create BCS applications. We wrap up the module talking about BCS security and how we extend our models so that they can be used by search. Let's begin with an overview of Business Connectivity Services. To ensure we're level set on what business connectivity services are, let's take a few minutes to look at a conceptual diagram, which I will use to explain the various pieces. Starting at the bottom of the slide, we have data, which we want to integrate into SharePoint. This data can be accessed from web services, WCF, SQL, really any system that contains data from which we want to integrate. Moving up the stack, we have SharePoint. SharePoint Server, we have three middle layers, which will allow us to bring in data from a line of business systems into SharePoint. The first is a business data connectivity runtime. This is the physical layer, which allows you to access data and pull it back into SharePoint. Next is the external content type repository. Think about this layer as abstraction for the connections to the line of business systems, which hides the details of how the systems are connected, so SharePoint does not need to worry about how to retrieve data from each different system. All the connection strings, data schemas, and connection options are stored in a central database repository within SharePoint. Above that, we have external lists. External lists allow you to present line of business data as native SharePoint lists. The main difference, however, is the data does not actually reside within SharePoint and is pulled directly from the line of business system each time the list is accessed. Moving out of SharePoint and up to the client, BCS also includes some client components which provide integration out of the box with Outlook, SharePoint Workspace, and Word. InfoPath is used as the forms technology to provide consistent user experience between server and client. And lastly, we have tooling investments with SharePoint Designer 2010 and Visual Studio 2010, which allow these tools to create external content type definitions which allow BCS to bring external data into SharePoint. Let's take a look at some of these components. Starting at the upper right-hand part of this slide, we have the SharePoint client, which calls into BCS requesting external data. The BDC runtime takes this request and looks up the connection information necessary to connect to and return the requested data from any number of back-end systems. The BCS metadata store is a SQL database which is used to store connection information, which describes how to connect to the back-end system. It also includes schema data, which describes the types of data which will be returned. And finally, methods, which define how to operate on that data, such as how we read, create, update, or delete. And finally, we need to know what kind of authentication we're going to use to connect these back-end systems. The BDC uses various connectors to actually connect to these back-end systems, whether that be a DB connector, WCF, or a .NET assembly connector. The BDC passes metadata to the connector, which allows it to connect and pull back the information we want. For example, in the case where a WCF connector is used, the URL is passed to the WCF connector, which generates a proxy based on the web services WSDL, which is used to connect to the back-end system. For a .NET assembly connector, which you will create in Visual Studio, this is your proxy or connection, and with it you can control how data is retrieved. For example, with all the out-of-the-box connectors, all of the out-of-the-box connectors actually connect to one system, that is, one SQL database or one web service. What if the data you wanted was stored in more than one system? Well, you could create a .NET assembly connector which would broker calls to the various systems and return the business objects or entities back to the BDC runtime. Moving to the left side of the slide, we have the BCS client for Office. With Office 2010, and more specifically the Pro SKUs and above, we installed a BCS client component, which allows the same functionality I just described in SharePoint to occur within Office. This symmetrical client and server experiences allow you to build solutions which can be deployed to the server and optionally, where required, deployed and leveraged within the Office client. The client has its own BDC runtime. and it too keeps metadata on how to connect to the backend systems. This means the client does not need to call back into SharePoint because it has all the data it needs to connect and consume line of business data. This is an important concept. The client does not connect through a proxy through SharePoint to connect to your backend system. So when you think about scenarios where you have SharePoint deployed into the extranet, which provides access to line of business systems hosted within your corporate intranet, it is important to understand users in the field may have access to line of business data hosted through SharePoint. However, they will most unlikely not be able to connect these line of business systems through the Office clients. The good news, however, is the BCS team thought about this and included a client data cache. This is a SQL CE database that does dual role in storing the BCS metadata, and it also functions as a cache for the line of business data to allow the Office clients to work offline against the line of business data in the cache, and then later, when connected, sync any changes with the backend systems. So what is an external content type? An external content type is a description or collection of metadata that contains information on how to connect to the external line of business system, whether that be SQL connection, WCF, SOAP web services, or any other type of system. External content types also include schema information on the type of data which is stored in the external system, as well as any behaviors which may be defined that describe how the data should be treated within Office clients, such as Outlook. All of this data is stored in the BCS database, which can be leveraged within Office clients or on the server within SharePoint. If you're familiar with the BDC in the last version of SharePoint, you may know it was only available on the SharePoint Enterprise SKUs. Well, this has changed quite a bit. While the BDC web parts and some other components still ship with the Enterprise SKU, you'll find that quite a bit of BCS functionality is available within SharePoint Foundation. In fact, the ability to create a custom .NET connector and use them with external lists and external data columns is now available in all SharePoint SKUs. Some BCS solutions make heavy use of or depend upon the secure store to enable single sign-on. These solutions will require a SharePoint standard SKU, and this is a big difference as you move forward from Foundation to Standard when you consider BCS features and related technologies. So let's talk about some of the improvements which have been made to the BDC runtime model. First up, it's important to notice, as we discussed in the previous slide, we have a symmetrical model. These new features are now available on both the server and on the client. Much requested capability was write back. Previously, the BDC officially supported only read operations. However, some actually did write back to work. It was not officially supported. Being able to write back to the system, to the LB system, allows for full CRUD operations. That is, create, read, update, and delete. Support has been added for batch read operations. This is a huge performance improvement. Consider the case where I need to pull a ton of information. This API allows me to do that in chunks or packages. I'll walk you through some code later where I show you how this is done. We add the ability to navigate and create associations between data and different entities in both the client and the server. Bulk API support was added, which allows me to call into the BDC asking for a number of specific items and have those returned in one shot. For example, let's say I have 5 contacts I want to pull out of the line of business system. I know the contacts I want, but rather than calling into the BDC 5 times, passing the ID of each contact, I can use this API to pass the IDs all at once, and the BDC runtime will run off and fetch those contacts and return them to me in a single operation. It's a very interesting capability, and I will show you some code later that demonstrates this. We now support reading blobs of data from the back-end system. And if that system supports streaming, we can then stream blobs of information through the BCS. We now have read and write capability for complex data types. So let's explain what we mean by complex types. Let's suppose we have a legacy type, which is an address. .NET does not have an address type, but it has strings and integers. That means we can use what we call dot notation within our C# code to write back into the system and just change the street portion of the address without having to understand the data types being used. Once you start working with BCS, you'll find a pattern to how different systems are modeled. For example, it's not that much different to model an application to connect to SQL as it is to model one to connect to a web service, once you understand methods, method instances, etc. Don't get me wrong, there are some slight differences. The model, however, is flexible enough to account for these differences. The real power comes from when you use these models within SharePoint and the Office clients. To the clients, they use the same interfaces to connect to the data, even if it resides in SQL, a web service, or even on disk as an XML file. BDC also includes extensibility mechanisms. As I'll demonstrate later, you can use Visual Studio 2010 to create a .NET Assembly connector project, which we can use to hit any data source you choose. In the Ignite developer session on search customizations, I will show you how we can create a custom connector which uses the BCS runtime to create what used to be called protocol handlers. This allows search to use your custom connector to crawl custom data sources. We can also create custom secure store providers where you can store credentials stored within different systems to connect to your line of business data. So let's stop here and take a look at a demo where we will create an external content type with SharePoint Designer.
Okay, in this demo we're going to use BCS to surface some line of business data that lives within SQL Server. So in SQL Server I have an AdventureWorks database and I have several tables. The table I'm interested in is this contact table, and we can open it up and you'll notice we have a open this up. We have many rows of data here, including the first name, last name, email address, phone number. And what we want to do is we want to bring this into bring this into SharePoint and surface this within SharePoint. And then we also want to take it offline within Outlook and have these show up as contacts within Outlook. And then we want to be able to, I want to show you how we can do full fidelity updating and reading of these back and forth. That's what we're going to do in this demo. Let's go ahead and close this guy down here. So let's begin by opening up SharePoint Designer, and we'll just connect to our internet site, which is internet.contoso.com for this example. And so what we want to do is we want to go to the external content types section within SharePoint Designer, and from here we want to create a new external content type. So we go up here to this new external content type in the ribbon, and then you can give this a name. So we'll just call this AW Contacts for AdventureWorks Contacts. And then because, as I mentioned, we want to go ahead and take this offline, so we want to make sure enable offline sync for external list is enabled, so that's going to be true. And then, as I mentioned before, we want to map this to a contact. So the office item type is going to be contact here. So once we have those things set, then we can go in here and create and connect to our external system. And we're going to add a connection. Now, we have three different connections out of the box. We have a .NET type, SQL Server, or WCF service. In our example here, we're going to select SQL Server, and then the database name that we want to use. And the database. And right now this is just to make the SQL Server connection, so connecting with a user's identity. So this is not going to configure a connection though in BCS. I'll show you how we do that later, but just keep in mind this is what's being used to actually make the connection right now. So we're just going to go ahead and use my credentials to do that. And then you see I have an AdventureWorks. It kind of reads all the tables and the views and store procedures. It was that contact that we care about. There it is right here. Now, so once we have the table that we care about, what we want to do is right-click on it and choose Create All Operations. So what this is going to do, it's going to create several operations for us. One is the Read Item operation, so where we want to read a specific contact. Read List operation is where we want to read in all of our contacts. Create, update, delete are our CRUD operations, so we want to create a contact, update a contact, or delete a contact. So in our example, we're just going to go ahead and create all operations. And this wizard starts, and so we're going to step through and we're going to map some things here. So the parameters that we're creating, you see it read all the columns out of the table, and so the contact ID is our primary key, and you can see that's kind of denoted here with this little key icon. And notice that it's already mapped it over here to as the identifier and to an int32. So we're good there. There's nothing really to do in this particular case, but if this is not detected properly, you do need to you need to make sure you set at least one of these as an identifier. And so for us, that was fairly simple. Now, what we want to do is there's a title, and this represents the person's title. Now, this is fine being mapped in, but what we want to do is there's this office property. And so what we want to do is we want to map this in as the title of the user. So what happens is, again, we're mapping as a contact. So title in this case, so this column is going to map to title in our contact's title. So first name, we'll do this here. That's our first name. We'll do last name. It's going to be our last name here, and then a suffix. There's our suffix. Email address. Yeah, I'll just do email address 1, and then phone number will be our primary telephone number. So those are the ones we'll map in. The rest of these we don't really care about in this particular case, but we'll go ahead and use these. Now we might want to add some filters. So in this particular case, we have that particular list that we're looking at is about, I think it was end up being I can't remember how many items, but there's quite a few thousands and thousands of contacts in that list. And in our example, we really only want contacts that map to a certain filter type, certain filter. So what we want to do is add a filter here. So we do have throttling in BCS. So if I were to just attempt to do this without a filter, what would happen is we would attempt to pull back every row of data in that table, and what ended up happening is we have by default the throttle is set to 1,000. It's not going to allow that to happen. So the way you can get around that is to set a filter. So you filter and grab the data that you specifically want, or what you could do is use PowerShell and up your threshold or up your throttling. So in this particular case, we want to go ahead and add a filter, and what we're going to do is we're going to add the suffix. So this is where, junior, senior, or the second or third. What we're going to do is we're going to set this, and we're going to add a filter. It's going to be comparison. It's going to equal, and it's going to equal, so we're setting a filter to equal suffix. So I said OK. And then the default value, and the value is null. So we want it to where it does not equal null. So this is where what we're doing is I'm setting, let me go back and show you this. So what I've done is set a filter. It's a comparison filter. So where the suffix does not equal, and then this value, which is null. So I think I looked at this before, this list, and I think there was 50 or 60, or we'll see in a little bit how many actual contacts do not have, that actually do have a suffix. There was a smaller amount. So that's what we want to do, is go ahead and use just users that happen to have a suffix. And we go ahead and finish. So at this point we've created our operations, so I can save. And what this is doing, this is writing it back to the BDC metadata store. So this is actually being stored in SQL within the BDC. Now let's go back and take a look at this. Now, a couple things to be aware of right out the gate. So notice that as administrator, I have execute, edit, set permissions, and selectable and clients. So I have all 4 permissions necessary. But notice nobody else does. So for me, I can do this all day long, but what would happen is if we wanted to share this with the users, I would have to get an administrator with permissions to set the necessary permissions properly for me to use this. So we'll actually, I'll show you that in just a little bit, but right now we want to go ahead and finish setting up our connection. So what we want to do, let me go back over here to external system. So here's our connection, and a couple things, you can see the names kind of just were brought down for us. But notice that we're going to connect to this database server. and this database name, SQL Server, we're going to use the user's identity. Now, that's going to mean that if we're going to keep it this way, it means Kerberos would have to be set up here for this to work, and that's probably not going to be the case in many cases, so we're going to have to change this. Also notice over here in the clients, we have two tabs. We have a default and a client, so I can actually set these independently of each other. So default is when it runs on the server, and client is when it runs on the client when we take it offline. So in our particular case, we want to go ahead and use a secure store. So what we want to do is impersonate a Windows identity, and then we're going to use a secure store application ID. So at this point, let's go set up our secure store. So we'll go down here to secure store, and I'll select manage, and we want to go ahead and create a new set of credentials, and we'll just call this AW contacts, and we'll just use that as a display name as well. So notice what I just created here. I just created the target application ID right here. So this is the ID that we need to use back in our connection. So we'll just set this as and we can set this to be an individual, individual ticket, individual restricted, individual. So we notice these ticket, so it means we're able to actually use claims here. What we're going to do is we're actually going to set ours to group, which means we're going to do a many-to-one mapping. So what that means is that we can actually set the set the credentials here, and that for a certain group of users, they will all use the credentials set here. So they'll become more clear here in just a second. So we've got our Windows username and Windows password are the field names that we want. Windows username, Windows password looks fine. Notice the password is masked. We could add additional fields here if we wanted to, but for ours, we're good to go. So we're going to hit next. And now, target application administrator. So we probably want to set the administrators that are able to set the credentials is who we want. So for me, it's going to be just the administrator. And so we'll just hit check name. And then for the members, so this is any users that can actually use these credentials. So we'll do this. So we have domain users. Okay, so we have our ADB contacts set up. So we want to go ahead and set the credentials at this point. Now, this will be what Windows username do you want to connect with. So in our case, connect as administrator. So it basically means that any user coming in here from domain users are going to use this set of credentials to actually connect to our SQL server. Okay, so we've got that set up. So let's go back. So we want to use that AW contacts now as our secure store ID. So this means those are credentials will be used. And we'll do the same thing. We actually can't do the same thing over here. What we can do is tell it to impersonate Windows identity and use this. Now, what's going to happen on the client side is they'll actually use, they won't be using the secure store that we just set up. They'll actually be using Credential Manager on the client to actually connect. So that's kind of what we're doing here. So let's go ahead and hit OK. And this will all save back in. Okay, good. So now let's go ahead, and our external content type is now set up and configured. So let's go ahead and we'll close this guy out. And so let's go ahead and create an external list. So right here is external list. It's now enabled. We'll select that, and then we'll call this contacts. And we'll just give it a second here to generate. So now our contacts list is now created, and we can go ahead and let's just go back over to the browser and take a look. And see we have the contacts. Okay, so here's our data that came directly from SQL. Notice it's right here in this list, and Everything's just been brought over, mapped over for us. Now, like any list, we can go in here and we can modify the view, create additional views, things like that. Um, so it's already created for us really in many cases. But let's take a look. Let's, for example, this guy. Notice you can tell I was messing around here playing earlier with the data, and I've got a suffix that looks kind of strange. So notice here the suffix is junior dash dash server. So we want to change that. Notice the form was created for us already. I can go in here and hit edit, and then I can go and actually change this back to be what we want. And then hit save, and then what I've done is then I've just written back to SQL Server. So you can tell that you can see here it's been reread back in, and I was able to actually update that record. So one of the other neat things and we can do is take this offline in Outlook. So this connect to Outlook is what you can click here, and what will happen is we will actually download a package, VSTO package, and it's automatically generated and open this into Outlook. So our installer, so we'll go ahead and choose to install, and we'll give it a little bit, and then it's installed, so we can go ahead and close. And then if we wait a second, our Outlook should open up, and we should have our list. So we've got a little message there. Okay, here we go. So Outlook is opened, and here comes, it's now syncing. So notice we've got contacts. It knew that these were contacts because we'd given it those behaviors, and it's already mapped them in here. So again, I've got, I can go back into this user that we had earlier, and notice the name is probably not what we want. Go into your full name. So notice the last name. Well, let's go ahead and change that. And then I can save. And then if we go back over here to this list, so this is this guy right here, we can refresh this. And notice it's been updated. So so as you can see, we've got full fidelity there working within SharePoint design. Within Outlook here too. So we can go back and forth, read and write. Now, a couple things that you need to be aware of is we have this conflict resolution that we have as well. So I can actually make a change here, and you can imagine somebody could make a change in the list back here, this external list, and we potentially might have a collision. So let's take a look at what that might look like. So let's go into here and let's edit this guy. And what we're going to do is I'm going to change the suffix to server. So this is going to denote that the server is actually the one that set this value. And then over here in Outlook, so we've got over here in Outlook, we have the user, and let's say we open this guy up and we change his suffix to Outlook. Now, it's not real imperative that you make sure that you save these at the same time. What's going to happen is Outlook reads and writes to its local cache, and then that actually syncs up with the server. So it's not super important that we do this exactly the same time, but I just kind of wanted to show you for this to actually cause an issue. It's relatively easy to do this. So I've got it set. So I'll go hit save here, and I'll write back to SQL. And then I'll go ahead and hit save here. Now, what will happen is we can probably do a sync. Yeah, notice we have a sync issue. So immediately we have an issue where we've made a change and something's happened, the server's made a change. So we can go into this guy, and right here it says this item is in error. Now, if we go into here, notice Outlook is our value that we set. Notice it doesn't say server, but what we need to do is when you look at view the details, it's going to bring up this dialog where we can resolve the conflict. So the conflict is saying that for this particular field, our external system value is server our local value is Outlook. So which do we want to keep? Do we want to keep the local value, or do we want to keep the external value? So let's just keep the local value. And so what will happen is our value will commit, and then we can go over here to the server. And you'll notice our suffix of Outlook is what actually was stored. So the conflict resolution happens for you automatically. Like I said, every time I go and click on this list here, it's not going directly to the SQL Server. What it's doing is it's actually going to the local database cache that I have. So it's very performant in that regard. And then, like I said, the updates and things happen for us in the background, and then the conflict resolution, we can handle that as well. So really neat way to take these things offline. If I had disconnected from, or I can actually turn off SQL and still be able to use these contacts here in Outlook, because they're just using the local cache, and then when I come back online, if I made any changes, those would just sync right up. So really neat way to be able to use line of business data within SharePoint and make it look just like a normal list, and then also be able to take that list offline within Outlook and be able to use it in some extremely interesting ways. So that concludes this demo.
So let's look at how we can use BCS to build custom solutions. So we'll start by looking at what tools, roles or personas, and solution types we can create using BCS. Starting at the bottom of the slide, we can see there are really two big buckets here, code and no-code solutions. The main difference between these is really in the personas, the tools they use to create these solutions, and whether BCS runtime manages the solution. When everything is managed by the runtime, the IT pros remain in control over what the users can do with their solutions. In the case of custom code, developers will use Visual Studio 2010 and really can do whatever they need to do to interface with a line of business data and bring it back into SharePoint. Moving up the slide from left to right, we can expect to see power users use SharePoint Designer to create external lists and potentially take those lists offline in Outlook and SharePoint Workspace. We also expect to see these users use external data columns to supplement data within SharePoint lists. As we move into the intermediate space, we expect to see more sophisticated power users and developers get involved to help create more highly customized applications. For example, we expect to see them using InfoPath forms to customize list forms and add declarative rules for validation. We also expect to see workflows which leverage BCS data through external lists or external data columns. Business data web parts and the chart web part can be used to display BCS data within SharePoint. The star next to the no-code bucket and the inclusion of the developer persona are really meant to call out that there is quite a bit of declarative customization that can be done by combining the tools from the SDK to create Outlook task panes and custom ribbons. While this is still considered no-code, there is some editing of XML files and using the SDK and some tools, which may require a bit of learning for some Power Information workers. And finally, we look at more advanced code-based solutions, where we expect to see these built by developers within Visual Studio 2010. These solutions will involve using code to create custom connectors, where aggregation, transformation, custom security may be required. They can also use custom code to enable integration of those Office applications, such as Excel and PowerPoint, which do not support BCS out of the box. These solutions may also require custom forms, which include business logic to properly render and create data on the backend systems. One of the bigger differences, however, between these solutions and the no-code solutions is how we can generate reusable components, which can be used across all three solution types to extend further what can be done with no-code. For example, custom web parts could be written and they could be deployed and leveraged within potentially many different solutions. So let's talk about solution creation approaches. Depending upon the tool you use to create your solutions, there are different approaches. In the case of SharePoint Designer, you actually have a live connection to SharePoint and the line of business system, and any changes you make to the tool will affect your server directly. Or you may have a development or QA environment, and you will migrate your solution into production later. In the case of a developer, we expect them to use the whole range of tools to create solutions and package these into WSP solution packages for deployment by IT administrators into production. So let's look at the various technologies we can use to build solutions for SharePoint hosted BCS solutions. External data columns, formerly known as business data list columns, are a column type which can be added to lists, which allows for adding line of business data to a list. These columns are read-only, and a copy of the data is stored within the list and is counted as part of the storage for the site. External lists allow line of business data to be surfaced within SharePoint as if the data were list data. For the most part, external lists behave just as any SharePoint list. This means sandbox solutions can access these lists, which effectively allows user-deployed solutions the ability to interact with line of business data. Chart web part and the business data web parts provide another no-code alternative to displaying and interacting with line of business data within SharePoint. Some of these web parts support using XSLT to customize their rendering, and as a result can be customized with SharePoint Designer, or you can supply your own XSLT. It's important to note that although BCS supports read and write capability to line of business data, these web parts only support read-only operations. The BDC-OM is the most flexible and lowest level method of accessing your line of business data through BCS. Later in this module, I'll show you some code examples of how we can use the object model. The SharePoint object model can be used to access external list data using the same calls that we make when we're accessing lists that have their data stored within SharePoint. One difference, however, is a link to SharePoint support running SP2010 against external list fails to generate the necessary entity classes. For more information on link to SharePoint, please see the corresponding Ignite module. The client-side object model is another option where Silverlight and other custom applications hosted outside of SharePoint can access external list data using the same method calls and object model used to access other SharePoint lists. Visual Studio 2010 includes a new BCS model SharePoint project item, which includes a designer to help model your entity classes. The project creates a farm feature with a feature receiver, which uses a SharePoint supplied feature receiver to automatically install your model into the BDC. The BC Model Designer allows a developer to construct entity classes, methods, method instances, parameters, filters, using a property grid type editor. The BDC Explorer allows for a hierarchical view of your model, which you can use along with the property grid to set properties on various nodes of your model. Visual Studio support for BCS connectors greatly reduces, if not even eliminates, the need to hand edit XML. If, however, you find the need to or feel more comfortable editing XML, IntelliSense will help keep your model within checks against the BDC model schema. Here's an example of a simple method which takes the idea of an identity and uses the BDC object model to return a type-safe object which represents the item requested. Notice how we need to instantiate a reference to the BDC service application as the first step. We then get a reference to the metadata catalog, which is used to store our entities. We then get a reference to the entity by name. The code up to this point is pretty boilerplate, and will be required in almost all cases where we want to reach into the BDC and pull back line of business data. At this point, we need to get the method instance we wish to execute. We do this by asking for it by name and passing the type of method instance. In this case, we're looking for a specific item, so we need the specific finder method. We now get a reference to our line of business system instance, which we will use to pass to our execute call into the entity. Because we know the arguments required to make this call, we can simply build the object array and populate the arguments. You may note Our method actually only takes one parameter, which is the ID of the object we want. However, you look at the model, you will note there are actually two parameters, with the second being the return parameter. So let's take a look at a bulk API example, where I want to pass the number of IDs and have the objects for those IDs returned to me in a single call. I've highlighted the important parts of the model. We need to define our in parameter as an array of integers and mark it as a collection. We also need to set our type on the method instance as a bulk specific finder. Now let's look at the code which you actually use the bulk API. As you'll probably notice, the first few lines of code are identical to what we went through before. The main difference here is that our method takes an array of IDs, and we ask for our bulk specific finder method instance. The return from the call to execute will be an array of AW contacts, which we'll pass back to the caller. Something to keep in mind: even though we make a single call into the BDC, the connector itself may make multiple round trips to the line of business system to pull back the data needed to fulfill the request. So let's look at a batching example. In this model, I've again highlighted the important pieces. A filter descriptor is used to pass the last ID, which acts as a high water mark to denote the last item we have received so far and where to start processing. The batch size is the number of items we want returned within the batch, and a has more data descriptor is used to determine when we have reached the end of the enumeration. We then create parameters on our method, which we'll use to implement the filter and note the association filter. In our method instance, we mark the type as a finder. So let's see what the code looks like to batch responses from a line of business system in which we want to pull a large amount of data. Again, we have our code, which we use to gain access to our service application, catalog, and entity. We then ask for our method instance, which implements the batch operation. Notice it's a finder method. Using the method instance, we get a collection of our filters. We set the batch size of a filter to 1,000 to denote we want to receive batches of 1,000 contacts. We then call the find filtered method, which returns us an enumerator. We create a data table to populate it with the items we receive back from the BDC. In this particular implementation, my connector honored the batch size, and on the 101st call to move next on the enumerator, there was a slight pause while additional data was pulled from the line of business system. Clients, such as Silverlight and Smart Clients, which use the client-side object model, can actually connect to our line of business data. When we expose external content types as external lists within SharePoint, SharePoint and BCS become a proxy by which these clients can tunnel back into the line of business data. Since external lists use the same object model and support all CRUD operations, these clients could potentially provide some very interesting capabilities outside of SharePoint and the Office Client platform. There are few limitations to this approach, however. The line of business types must be able to be represented within a table. Some very complex line of business systems have data objects which do not lend themselves well to being formatted in a table. The ID field, or the primary key, must be of type int32. No bulk API support means that when you access the list to pull out one item based on the ID, the entire list is read from the line of business system, and then the item is returned. SP list item and list item are not strongly typed. And finally, there is no blob streaming support available with these solutions. Okay, let's have a demo at this point where we can go over the steps necessary to create a .NET connector in Visual Studio.
So let's take a look at some of the tools that we can use to create BCS connectors in Visual Studio. So I want to show you just a little overview of the tools themselves. So we create a new, just do a new project, and then SharePoint 2010, and we can select just an empty SharePoint project, or we can select this business connectivity model, which we can add to an empty project later, but I'll just, for simplicity, I'll just select that here. It'll deploy as a farm solution, and we'll go ahead and create this. So I just want to show you a little bit of the experience when you create a new project from scratch, and the things you get. So here's our designer, entity designer, so you can actually come through here and edit the identifiers and various methods. So you actually are going to use three tools primarily. You're going to have this, we'll go ahead and pin this down here. You're going to have the method details here, kind of an overview of the different methods and the parameters they take. And then, as I was showing you before, you have this top section, which is the designer for the entity itself. And then you have over here on the right this BDC Explorer, and you're going to use this with the properties. And this Explorer over here is going to allow you to navigate the various model and line of business instances that we're going to have. So you can go through here, you can notice we have our line of business system instances, and you can set different properties. We have our entity, and we have a read item. So this is our method that we care about on our entity, to read a specific item or read a list of items. And then we have our parameters. So hanging off our parameters in this particular case is an ID, and then we have our type descriptor. And so you can see this ID down here using the properties is of type string, and so just it's a much nicer experience. In many cases, you're not really going to have to edit the XML. So this is still backed by an XML file, and so it's not. You won't find a lot of cases where you need to edit these things. Whenever you need to add any custom properties, which is pretty typical for some scenarios, you have this property that are right here that you can just open up and just type in the name, the type, and the value. So, and I'll show you an example of what that looks like. But one of the things I've found, which if you want to put ACLs or access control lists right into your model, you'll still need to go into the XML to do that. The designer itself doesn't support that, but it's probably a case where you probably don't do that often. So this is really what the experience looks like. We'll go back over here to the solution, and so this is the model. This is that BDCM. So this is your model that you have here, and the diagram is our backing file that allows us to render it like this. We have, I'll go ahead and close that down. So we have this entity, and this entity is our line of business object. So as you saw previously in the model, entity 1 is our object, so our line of business object. So this would be something like a product or an order or a contact. So this represents your business object. The entity service, this is the code, or almost you could think about this as the code behind, if you're coming from ASP.NET, where if you think about the model as being your ASPX page, and then this being your CS page that backs that, or your VB page that backs that. This is really what's happening. So this is taking the various operations, the methods such as read item and read list, and then returning the entities back to the caller. So this is really when you create these, what we're doing is we're creating the .NET assembly connector. So this is kind of the flexibility you have. You can go after anything, web services, SQL, or in many cases there might be you want to return an entity here or a business object here that may actually come from several back-end systems. So what you're going to be writing here in this service might be some kind of broker system that actually goes and gathers the various pieces and builds the entity that you want to return. So this is a little bit of what the experience is going to look like. So let's go ahead, and I want to show you one that I've been working on that's a complete example, and we'll just kind of walk through the code and show you what that looks like. So this is, in the first demo I showed, we had the VentureWorks contacts, and I showed you how we could use that in external, to define an external content type, and then use that to within an external list, and then I also showed you taking it offline within Outlook. And that was using the SQL, the out-of-the-box SQL connector, and then it was also using, I used SharePoint Designer to create that. This is really what I've done is I've created the same thing, but I've done that within Visual Studio to kind of show you I guess the Visual Studio way of doing the same thing. Now, previously that was no code, and in this particular case I've got code. So what I've done is I've created a AW contact, which represents my one and only entity that I have. Now, it's not clear, I guess, in the last two demos I showed you, or last two projects I showed you, you can actually have many of these. In this particular case, I just have one, but just keep that in mind. I have an identifier, which is the ID, which again is my primary key. And I went ahead and created some methods. So I've read list, which reads all of the items. Read item, which reads a specific item. Delete item, create item, which deletes and creates the items. Update, so it updates the contact. And then I have these two, read items in bulk and read list batched. And those two I showed you earlier in the slides. I showed you the example code of that and what those look like. I'm not going to cover them here, but I did want to cover these other operations and show you what those kind of look like. So let's kind of scoot this around here a little bit, and I want to go to the BDC Explorer, and I want to show you so here's our entity that we have, and then like I said, everything really hangs off of that as far as operations. So let's take a look at this create. So the create I have two parameters. This one is the contact. So what I'm doing is I'm actually passing. So when I want to create a new contact, I'm going to pass a contact of type AW contact in, and then that's what will be instantiated within my database or within my line of business system. In this particular case, I'm still going against the same SQL database, same SQL table that we were previously, just for parity, just so you can see how this works from both approaches. Now, I have a contact, and what I've done is I create my type descriptor, and then notice I set the type name. So I'm using the full name of my type, and then I give it this little alias here. This is not really used in what I'm doing, but just keep that in mind. This right here represents your namespace plus your type. Now, what you do off of that is you need to create these subtype descriptors. So these type descriptors, its parent is contact. So I need to describe what is inside of this AW contact. And really what I've done is I've pulled back 4 fields. The ID, which is going to represent my primary key, the email, name, and phone. Now, the phone number, name, and email. So what I've done is I've gone through and defined all of these. For example, email, you can see it's a string, and something important on a creator. Let me go back. On a, let me get rid of this. On a creator, and this is a create item, so we kind of call this a creator method. What happens is when you come down through here, you need to make sure that you set this value up here to creator field. So this is how the BCS knows that, hey, you need to pass in, this field needs to be passed in, and it's also allowed to be created. So what I've done is I've set all of these, the name, the phone, and email as creator fields. The ID field, however, I don't set as a creator field because the ID will be generated for me by the system. So, when we're creating a primary key, typically in SQL, what will happen is you will actually get that back as usually the pattern is you'll hand that back as the identity that was just created. So in this particular case, we don't need to pass in this as a creator field because it'll be created for us. So this is what we're passing in. Now what we're returning is this return parameter, and I just call it return parameter here. Again, I've specified the same type of I call it something else here, but I've the same object, and notice, like for example, we'll just pick email. So notice it's not a creator field. It's just describing the field as it comes back. So this is the type name, the adventure work, the AW contact object, or the entity, and so here it is being returned. Delete item takes a parameter. One, you notice it's an in parameter, so the direction's in, and takes an ID. And then the type is, type descriptor shows that the name's ID, and it's in32. So really nothing important here other than you need to make sure you mark this is the identifier. So this, it's not really clear here, but keep in mind I could have had this be called contact ID and then have it actually be the identifier that identifies back to this ID here. So I happen to use the same name, so it might be a little confusing, but just keep that in mind, that that's really what you're doing, is you're saying, hey, look, this parameter being passed in is my identifier, so it is my primary key. So something to keep in mind. The let's see, read item is again the same thing. You pass in an ID. The return parameter is going to be the same type of AW contact here. Something to keep in mind also when you look at these, when you look at the method, notice there's not a lot here on the method, but it's these parameters that become important. So for example, this parameter is an in, and so you've got an in, out, and return, and you can only really have one return. So you'll see that I can't really have multiples here. So here's my return parameter. This name is not really used. It's just it's used in the model itself, so you can call it whatever you want. This name, however, does tie back to the name that's being passed into your system that you're going to actually, the code that you're going to write, and I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. And then the last one I want to show you was this update. It's a little different. So the update actually is going to take the input parameter I called contact, and it's an in, and then the type descriptor is going to be a type of an AW contact. And then when I'm describing this, all these parameters, like for example email, I need to make sure that I go and set this updater field to true. This is my updater, so this says, hey, look, when you pass this in, I'm going to be changing this guy or potentially changing this guy. It's used for an update. So if you had a field, for example, that you did not want to be updated, let's say, for example, it's like, for example, a when created date time field. You probably wouldn't want that to be updated, so you wouldn't set this to true. But for my email, my name, and my phone, I do want to be able to update those. Now, this is kind of a special case, so I want to pass in this ID, so I set it as an updater field. Now, this doesn't mean, though, that I'll be changing the value. In other words, I need the value to be able to go back and update the right row in the database. But what I do is I set this pre-updater field, which then allows me to actually use that ID. That ID comes in, and then I can use that ID to go ahead and set that field. But I'm not going to be able to really edit the field at this point, but it's a field that I definitely do need to perform the update operation. So that's kind of what that looks like. Let me show you what this looks like in XML. So let's go. Oh, actually, before I do that, let me show you my entity, or my object here. So this is my AW contact. It's very simple, just really 4 fields: the ID, name, and phone, as you saw previously. And in my case, this is I pull this from a database. So I pull it from we have it, when you're running through, you have a data row, right, when you pull back from a database. So this is just a little constructor that I use to go and pull back those items from my query. So this is specific to my implementation. So it's not really something that you may find that you use all the time, but it's not specific to BCS, so it's just kind of something I do here. The service is you can think about it as your proxy or your service. This is the guy that's actually going to go back and get and fetch your data. So he's the implementation of your methods themselves. So, for example, read item, you may remember back when I showed you that it takes one parameter, which is the ID. So there's the ID, and then what I do is I just call run SQL return data table, and I just pass the I've got some constant strings here that I just format, and then I'm able to pull back that information. Then this is that row to contact that I use, and this is just a simple helper function that I use just to go and take a data row and then just format it right into a contact. So I can do that here, um, or I could have just used a constructor here as well, but just to show you different ways of doing it. So really what this is doing, it's going against SQL, just as as we were previously in the other example. Here's my read list. Again, very simple, and I'm returning a collection of AW contacts. Delete item. So this is one of those where I want to just run SQL, but I don't really want to do anything. So this guy runs just a helper function called run SQL that's going to run the item to delete. This is the create item. So notice I pass in an AW contact, and then what I do is I format the name into various parts. My table, table that's stored in SQL is expecting a first name, potentially a middle name, last name, and then a suffix. And what I'm doing here, just in this little helper function, is I just using any spaces within the name. I just try to determine if it was a first name, if it's a last name, and try to put those into the right fields for SQL. And then I put those into these arguments. And then, of course, I put in the email and the phone number here as these other arguments. And then I pass those into this create contact, which is my SQL statement. And just format that string and just instantiate the new contact. What that will do, this run SQL return int will actually return the ID or the primary key, if you will, of the new contact we just created. So then what I'll do is I'll call this read item, which is exactly the field up here that takes the ID, and I pass back my contact. So that's what's going on there. The update, same sort of thing. I need to go ahead and parse out that contact name, which I store as a full name, and then try to determine the first, last, middle name suffix. Using the phone and email again here. The only difference in really that you're going to find here is that I need to have that contact ID. So this is going to be doing an update from contacts where contact ID is going to equal this integer that was passed in. And then I'll just run SQL. I'm not really returning anything, just return a void. So I don't really need to return anything in this case. This is that read items bulk, and this is the read items read list batch, which you need to write your own implementation if you want to support this. The external list is not going to call into these guys. So I've shown you the code. Let's go and look at that model now in XML, and you can just select open with, and you select XML editor, and let's kind of squeeze this down a little bit, and let me show you what this looks like. Collapse this down a little bit. So we start with the line of business system. So the model is the root of our XML document, and then we have these line of business systems that we can create. So you can create multiple line of business systems inside of a single model. In my case, I just have one here, and I call it the AdventureWorks. The type is the .NET assembly. So this is letting them know that we have an assembly that's going to be used to back this model. And then we have the display name, and then I have this is cached as true. So this means the model can be cached in memory to help speed up the processing. So whenever we reach into the BDC service application, pull this model back, we can actually cache it, and just help speed things up. So we have this access control list. This is what I was mentioning before, which you can edit it here, or you can go into the BDC service application and then set your permissions there. I just went ahead and set just a simple access control list to just show you that I'm allowing domain users to execute this line of business system or select it in clients. And then I do the same thing here for domain admins, except for I allow them all the rights, so these 4 rights. And in the next couple slides, we'll kind of go over what each one of these mean. Excuse me. And then we have our line of business system instances. And what this is just a descriptor on your line of business system. So what we have, and I'll talk about in a little bit, is this show, search, and UI. So we have some properties that I showed you before you can set in that property grid, and this is kind of where they get set. And almost every element, if you will, within the BCS has this property collection. So in my case, I want to set this show and search UI. And notice it doesn't really, I told it was a string, but it didn't really say anything about what the value is. But that's okay because just being present in the property here is what's going to allow it to be shown within search. And again, we'll talk more about this in the next coming slides in the presentation. So let's go back and look at our entities. So we can have one or more entities, as I mentioned. I only have one, and my entity is, excuse me, the AW contact. And notice I have a namespace that I use here, and then I have like an instance count and things like that. So in here, I have properties, just like I had before. I have the class. So this is the class, which is what implements my entity. Then I can set a default action, which is down in my actions. I can have multiple actions and set one as the default, and that's kind of the way you do that here. And then this is what I kind of did before if you saw the other demo, this Outlook item type. So I'm setting as a contact. So whenever this entity is being surfaced within Outlook, I want you to treat it like a contact. So it has behaviors like a contact. So that's necessary to have it perform that way. So that's what I've done here. And then my identifier, this is again just identifying the primary key, called it ID, it's type of system N32. And then here's my various methods. Here's the read list, and notice one of the properties I set on read list is what we call a root finder. And I just set the property as being X. Again, this is needed by search, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but you want to set this on this read list. The parameters, so these are the parameters to my method. So I have one parameter, if you remember before, on the read list, which is I called it return parameter. It's kind of what the name I use on all mine. And then the direction is return. So remember, I can only have one of those. So that's my one parameter. Then I have the type descriptor. So this is what defines the type that's being returned. In my case, what I'm going to be returning is a generic enumerator, which is of type AW contact. And then you need to make sure you set this is collection to true, so we know that it's handled properly. And then inside of here, what I do is I set my type descriptor of AW contact, which the type name. So notice I've got the type of AW contact, and then what I do is then I go and set the various type descriptors that I showed you before, the ID and 32, the name, phone, email, which are all strings, and then I make sure to note that this is my identifier as well. So this is what marks the specific identifier of ID. So that's this method. That's read list. Same thing for read item, pretty much. Delete item. It's actually probably one of the simpler ones. The in parameter here is the ID, and the type descriptor is setting it as the ID, and it's also the identifier. And then I mark the method instance, so this is the descriptor for this method. I'm saying, hey, that method with these parameters, it's a deleter, and you're going to call the delete item method on my class. It's going to support this. So that's what's going on there. And here's create item. And here's update item. So one thing I want to point out on the update item, which is a little tricky, is you've got your parameter. Remember, I take in my in parameter is a AW contact, and I just called it contact on my method. And this is where I was showing you before, where you have your updater fields set to true, which is necessary for all of these, and then for your one ID, that ID field, that you need to make sure you have the pre-updater field. If you fail to include this, you'll get an error, or if you fail to include this, you'll get an error. Or if you don't include either one of them, what will happen is you'll get an error, but the error will just say, hey, basically I can't pass this along because there is no ID. I've got an ID but parameter, but there's no ID field available because it won't find it in the update operation. So just ensure you do that. Let me go back to the create because I did want to show you the same sort of thing over here. This is one of those other special fields where you need to pass these in as creator fields. Notice the name, phone, email are okay are used for creation, but the ID is not. So that's what you have here. This is exactly what I was showing you before in the designer. So then we have my read item bulk and read item batched, and then I can go through here and add actions here as well. So in this particular case, I have a view contact, and I just have it set to have a URL. I'm sorry, an image that I just set, and I just take you to the home page. And I haven't really implemented anything here, so this is just to show you something in my demo. And then you can select the default display name, and then open, if you're going to open a new window or not whenever you click on this. Now, this is the ID that's being passed, so the 0. So what you need to do is you need to make sure you set your action parameters, index 0. What is that? Well, it's going to be the ID of the specific object being passed. So that's typically the pattern that's used here. One thing I did want to show you up here in the read item, and this is to help with our implementing this as a contact. Remember, in Outlook, we need to go through and we need to set a few properties on a few of these guys. So here's our name. This is, again, our type descriptors being handed back is the AdventureWorks, the AW contact. And our name, we want to set a property on that name as being the office property is the key, the value is full name. So what we're doing is, if you remember from the first demo, when I did that mapping where I mapped the various properties to an office property, that's what I'm doing here. So I've got, if you read this, the way you read this is name is going to map to the office property of full name, phone is going to map to the office property of primary telephone number, and then email is going to map to the office property of email 1 address. So that's kind of the way that works. So let's go back over here to the model. Now, what's pretty neat here is let me go back over here. So notice the features already created for us. I just kind of edited some things here, and it's going to be a farm level feature. So that's necessary for this to work. It's not going to work otherwise unless it's set to a farm. So just keep that in mind that's a requirement. And so this actually gets created for us. So we have this is going to actually get instantiated for us automatically. And so what we'll do is we'll go ahead and I can build this, and then we'll go ahead and deploy, and I'll show you how we use this within SharePoint. So let's go ahead and deploy. And so, whenever you do this, one of the things to look at is down here is, you're looking at this bottom area here. So it's deploy started, and then right now it's adding solution. And we'll wait for it to finish, and deploy succeeded. So we're ready to use this model now. So before we use the model, let me show you just exactly how that got instantiated. So we've deployed our model. It's there. It's inside of the BDC database. So let me show you just a quick look back over here. So we didn't write any code, any kind of event receiver code or anything. So how did that model actually get imported into the BDC? So out of the box, what we have here is we have this receiver assembly that gets put in here for us automatically inside of our model. And what it's going to do is it's going to call into this receiver class called import model receiver. And so what that's going to do is this class is going to use the admin object model and it's going to go ahead and import that model and read the model and then import it into the BDC runtime for us. So that's kind of how we got away with that and not really doing much work. So that's kind of that's super nice and very helpful. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at the website that we've just deployed to, and that's our intranet website. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and create an external list. So let's just go down to here to more options. And in this particular case, we're not really going to use SharePoint Designer here as we did previously. So just because we've already done everything we need to do inside of Visual Studio. So we want to create a list. We want to create this external list. I'll go ahead and create, and then what we'll do is select contact. We'll call it contacts. Yeah, I want to go ahead and use it in the quick launch bar, and then let's go ahead and pick our external content type. So here's our eventual works contacts, and we'll hit create. And so what we just did was we just created an external list, and as you can see here, it's pulled back our name, phone, and email just like we're used to seeing. And notice we also have the ID here as well. And then what's real neat is that we're actually able to read from the methods on our in our model, and we're able to get this edit item, and we can also delete the item. So let's take a look at the edit item, and let's change something here. So let's just change this phone number to last four. We'll call it 0000, and we'll hit save. So this just wrote back to our database using our service, and you can see that it wrote back. We can also actually create a new item. So if we go into items, new item. So notice there's no ID here. We've got our item that we can just go ahead and type a name, email, and phone number. So we'll just call this and so what I just did was just created a new contact in our list. So what we also can do, since we gave it those behaviors for Outlook, we can actually connect this to Outlook just as we did previously. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. And so what's going to happen is a new VSTO package is going to be created for us, and we're going to download this. And so we'll go ahead and install. And then it's installed, so we can go ahead and hit close, and then we'll wait a little bit, and then what will happen is this will actually, if Outlook's not already running, what it'll do is it'll go ahead and start Outlook for us automatically. So now what's interesting about this is now we're actually using Outlook to actually go back and hit and pull in all this information. So what's really neat about this is that we're using our same assembly that I created before, and we're actually from Outlook it's being able to pull all this information back. So it's a pretty neat functionality, just as you saw previously. If you notice down here at the bottom, you can see the items counting up as more and more items are being pulled down. We can also, if you go back over here, let's take a look at let's copy this guy here, and we'll search for him. Yeah, we don't have search installed yet, but we can find him. So here you can see I've got all the guy's information here. So his phone number is here, and we can change this. So we'll go ahead and change this to 1111, and we can go ahead and save, and that will be written back to. Yeah, we don't care about this. So we'll go ahead and save that back. So we've changed our phone number. So on the website, we should eventually see a new phone number. Yeah, so we have our new phone number. So we're able to use, again, going back and forth and being able to write into this information. Again, SharePoint here is actually reading from the database as well as Outlook is doing the same thing. So Outlook's not being used and proxying through SharePoint to get this information. The assembly that we wrote is actually running here, and it's being used to access the information directly. So as I mentioned before, we are going to use a database in the back end to actually cache this information. But what I can show you is, let's just show you how our project we created was this BCS demo project. So what I can do is we can just do find BCS demo using Process Explorer, and what we can do is we can find the assembly loaded up, and notice it's loaded right here in BCS sync. So it's BCS sync is the guy that's actually doing the work for us to go back and forth and load our assembly, and then call into our assembly to go and hit the back-end database. So you notice it gets downloaded. Well, actually, it's actually loaded in the GAC in this particular case, but the BCS sync. So it's not really Outlook that's doing this; it's BCS sync. The same thing whenever we use SharePoint Workspace. BCS sync will be used for that as well. So that's kind of how that works. Let's go back over here. So the same sort of, as I showed you before in the previous demo, the same sort of conflict resolution happens here. Nothing really different. But as you can see, it's writing the code yourself. You actually have a lot more flexibility, and again, being able to be able to define exactly how you go after and fetch this data, whether that be on the client or on the server, is extremely powerful. A way to actually bring in line of business data into Outlook, as well as being able to bring it into, really, you're exposing it really to almost any Office client. There's some additional work you have to do with some Office clients than others, but being able to do that and then also do it within the server side in SharePoint, and just only do it once is a really powerful thing. So I encourage everybody to take a look at this, because it's pretty neat, the stuff that you can do with this. And so really that concludes this demo. So thanks a lot.
So let's talk a little bit more about BCS security on authentication. Often, one sticking point which must be addressed before deploying any BCS solution is deciding how to authenticate to the line of business system. Often, the owners of the line of business systems have an idea of how they would like users to authenticate. Line of business system owners may want users to authenticate with their Windows credentials, or maybe they're fine with a single service account, or it's possible the line of business manages its own set of credentials specific to the application, which need to be used to access the system. So let's take a look at each of these scenarios. The BCS runtime has several modes of authentication when dealing with line of business systems. Pass-through is a mode. Pass-through, this mode uses the current user's credentials to access the line of business system. Unless the line of business system resides on the same machine as SharePoint, the Kerberos protocol will be required when running in this mode, because we have a double hop issue. That is, the client has authenticated to the SharePoint server, but that does not mean the process running on that server can reach across to another system as that user. Using Kerberos on the server can make a request to using Kerberos, the server can make a request to the KDC and request a delegatable ticket on the user's behalf, and then present that ticket to the line of business system. Some IT departments have found the infrastructure needed, the difficulty in setup, and the relaxing of some policies to allow Kerberos delegation prohibitive enough to not adopt this solution. The advantage, however, in this approach is it allows users to authenticate directly with the back-end system using the user's credentials. With revert to self mode, which is named after the method call which stops a thread from impersonating, the service account will be used to access the line of business data. In the case of where the request is being sourced from the IS, this will be the application pool account. The line of business system administrators must grant this single account enough privileges within the system to allow SharePoint solution to run. Sometimes this means granting almost admin level permissions to different parts of the system, even though some users, which might use the SharePoint hosted application, might not have this level of permission. This means the BCS solution must enforce authorization, and this is not likely the type of control the line of business system administrators are going to be willing to give up. In addition, this can add complexity to your BCS application when adding this type of authorization. SSO authentication uses a secure store to store and retrieve credentials. As we saw earlier, SharePoint 2010 standard and enterprise SKU ship with a secure store service, which can be used to store credentials with BCS. It can be used, and BCS can use these to access line of business systems. BCS calls into the secure store service passing an application name, which is really just a string identifier, which is used to help locate the specific credentials required. Once the credentials are returned, BCS uses those to connect to the line of business system. SharePoint 2010 Secure Store Service has been extended to support storage of claimed credential types. SharePoint Secure Storage Service can be configured to map credentials either one-to-one, where an authenticated user has a set of credentials, or one-to-many, where a group of users share a same set of credentials. Using the Secure Store Service is a great way to avoid the double hop issue. Since the server has access to the credentials, it can use those credentials to navigate off the box and connect to the remote system using those credentials. Credentials can also be used for impersonation, where required, as typically the credentials include a domain, username, and password. The BDC runtime will throw a BDC auth exception when credentials are not found within the secure store, or if the BCS connector detects an authentication exception from the external data source. Users can be directed to a default or custom page, which can collect their credentials to populate the secure store, or in the case where a group credential is used, these credentials can be pre-populated by an administrator. If you happen to have your own single sign-on service or credential store, you can use the iSecure Store Provider interface to create your own provider, which can be used to contact your custom credential store. When we look at BCS connectors and consider the popular authentication types, we can clearly see that in most cases, if you're writing a custom .NET connector, you'll most likely be writing code to authenticate with that line of business system, unless you are using Kerberos, which again allows us to navigate to the line of business system as the current user, or until in pass-through, which, as we mentioned earlier, uses the IS application pool account. BCS has 4 rights which can be assigned to control authorization. The edit right is the ability to edit, create, update, or delete metadata objects. This right is typically assigned to administrators and BCS solution designers. Execute is the ability to consume line of business data, and in most cases will be required for anyone who wants to use the line of business system within SharePoint. Set permissions allows permissions to be set on BCS objects. In most cases, you will only want to allow administrators this right. Selectable in clients is the ability to select a line of business system from the BCS catalog to use this system within SharePoint, basically using the entity picker. Those permissions can be added to ACLs on models, line of business systems, entity, and methods from within central administration, or using the admin object model, or declaratively within the model itself using XML. So let's take a quick look at what it takes to make your BCS model searchable. By default, when you use Visual Studio 2010 to create a custom .NET assembly connector, the model will not be available to search. Setting a few specific properties, however, will allow you to select your model through the BCS content source search UI. First, you need to add a property named Show and Search UI at the line of business system. This is the only property needed to cause your model to appear in the BCS content sources configuration UI. You will need to have a root finder and specific finder method and instances. In most cases, these will already be present. Optionally, you can specify a last modified timestamp field, which is the field on your entity which represents the date and time of when the object was last modified. Search will use this value when performing incremental crawls. Without specifying this value, all crawls, whether they be incremental or full, will crawl your entire line of business system using the root finder and specific finder methods. Another option is to have a Windows Security Descriptor field property on your specific finder, which identifies the field of your entity, which will supply an ACL back to search. This will allow search to security trim the results or can be passed to a custom security trimmer. In this module, I provided an overview of BCS and discussed how to create BCS applications. We then wrapped up the module talking about BCS security and how we can use our models within search. I hope you found this module helpful.